Please welcome Jason Lessard to the podium. He's taking it from here.
Thanks, Robert. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Jason Lessard. I'm the Executive Director of the Alaska Mariculture Alliance. And please help me welcome the following speakers to the stage. We have Maile, Branson, Provan, Crump, Eric Wyatt, Francis Pan, Henry Fleener, James Crimp, and Tamsin Peoples. So at the conclusion of all of our presentations, questions for our panelists may be taken from the audience. Questions can be submitted through throughout the presentation via the Slido app. There's a QR code that will be put up on the screen. You can scan that now and submit your questions throughout these presentations. And alternatively, you can raise your hand during the Q&A and someone with a microphone will come to you. So please wait for that microphone so that all of the folks here can hear your question. Our first panelist, Maile Branson with CRRC's Alutiiq Pride Marine Institute, is presenting an abstract titled Alutiiq Pride Marine Institute, 30 Years of Mariculture in Alaska. Please help me welcome Maile. Do we have the clicker for the slides somewhere? Okay. And it should be green and red, so forward and back.
Okay. All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm Maile Branson with the Chugach Regional Resources Commission and the Alutiiq Pride Marine Institute. And in celebration of 30 years in operation, conducting various different kinds of mariculture research, I would like to talk to you guys a little bit today about all of the wonderful things that we do at our facility. And please excuse, I'm very pregnant, so breathing is getting kind of hard, so. Okay, a little bit about who we are. Chugach Regional Resources Commission. We are a consortium of 7 South Central Alaskan tribes that was originally formed in the mid-'80s with the goal of natural resource management and advocacy from a policy standpoint. A lot of people felt like they weren't being heard in spaces where decisions were made with respect to natural resources. And so the tribes got together and decided to form this consortium to advocate for them. And since then, it has expanded into a whole myriad of different things, including mariculture research. And we own and operate the Alutiiq Pride Marine Institute in Seward, Alaska. So this is just a snapshot of all of our tribes. Again, there are 7 of them: Port Graham, Chiniga, Seward, Valdez, Nanwalik, Titlik, and Cordova. And just to orient you guys, this is the Alutiiq Pride Marine Institute in Seward. We share a campus with the University of Alaska Fairbanks Seward Marine Center and the Alaska Sea Life Center, and we are down on the waterfront in downtown Seward. Oh, it's auto-skipping. This is a little bit, this is kind of an overview of what our facilities look like. So in the interior of the facility, we are split into 3 main modules. They are biosecure research modules that can be reconfigured in any way that people please. So this is just one of them where most of our clam rearing occurs. This is our biology laboratory space. We are actually in the process of building out an entirely new biology laboratory space that will be about triple this size. So we're really excited about that. We currently have the capacity to do receptor binding assays, enzyme-linked immunosorbent assays, and PCR and various different types of metagenomic and molecular work. We also have an oceanographic laboratory space. It currently houses our Berkelator, which I think is Berkelator number 2. And we have one of the longest running ocean acidification monitoring programs that's community-based in Alaska. And so we are very proud of that. And we're currently working with a bunch of other tribal communities to expand that monitoring program. We are also working on developing nutrient analyses in-house, and we should have that up and running soon. So I like to view what we do as kind of a 3-pronged approach. So mariculture, of course, research, and oceanographic monitoring. and biological monitoring. And I'd like to say a word about the importance of what we do. And again, our organization is tribally led, and we operate at the directive of our board. So all of our research projects are projects that were conceived through kind of a two-eyed seeing process and a traditional ecological knowledge exchange. So our board members come to us, you know, they bring up an issue or an economic problem that they would like us to address, and we work together with them to come up with projects and research goals. And as you can see, the ocean is very important to the people in our region, and a common saying in the region is when the tide is out, the table is set. So the ocean is kind of a central feature in subsistence lifestyles in South Central Alaska. Okay, so I'm kind of gonna run through just like a lightning overview of some of the projects that we do. Kelp Mariculture is a big one for us. We currently work with 9 different farms in the Prince William Sound region. These are all experimental farms, although we are working on converting some of those to commercial farms because it seems kind of wasteful to grow a bunch of kelp and then have to dispose of it. And so we're working on that, but that is up and coming. We primarily focus on the 3 main species that most people look at, sugar, ribbon, and bull. But we are also looking at a couple of other species as well. And of course, most of these farms are centered around our communities, and the goal is, again, economic development and scientific research. We've also been working with Dune and the folks at the Native Conservancy, as well as some other private farmers in the room, to establish mobile kelp hatchery facilities, and that kind of knowledge transfer has been really key in economic development in the region. This is one of, I believe the one on the left-hand side is Dunes. So this one, actually, we initially worked with it in Seward, and then it went to Cordova, and it is up and running as a mobile kelp hatchery there. We are also looking at evaluating a couple of different scientific questions. So what oceanic conditions do kelp like to grow in? We collect water quality data, nutritional data, and then a couple of other hydrocarbons and some other contaminant-based data just to evaluate the value of the kelp in the region. And then we also look at economic questions. You know, is this a feasible method of economic development in these communities? And there is Tesha harvesting some kelp. Another big focus of ours is native species in mariculture. So we have a couple of species that we feel very strongly about that we work with that are native to Alaska that we feel could be repurposed into an aquaculture setting, specifically cockles. We work a lot with cockles, little neck clams, butter clams, and some other species, but cockles are kind of a major focus of this effort. And they actually do really well in hanging oyster cages. So we've been working with some folks to try and determine how feasible that is from a commercial perspective as well. There's some little neck clams that we've been working with. We've been doing a series of ocean acidification exposure studies with oysters. We do have oyster spat from time to time, although not commercially. They're mostly experimental. We are also looking at reinvigorating our king crab program. About 10 years ago, we worked through the ACT crab program to establish hatchery and grow out models for red king crab, and that is something that we are working on starting up again. We received funding from a couple of different sources to work on abalone hatchery models as well. And I believe one of our staff is going to present a poster on that, so I won't go into that in too much detail. We are also working with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in Canada to look at sea cucumber aging using quantitative PCR. So we are growing sea cucumbers to work on that project in collaboration with them. We also do quite a bit of intertidal species research and restoration. So this focus is mostly on clams and chitons, which the local people call bidarkies. And these are organisms of subsistence importance that the people of the region feel very strongly about that have been declining in numbers, particularly since the Exxon Valdez oil spill. And most of these species, kind of our model is very similar. We collect them, the broodstock as adults, we spawn them in-house, and we research kind of spawning and rearing methods in-house. And once we outplant them, we will also research outplanting growth and success rates. So we kind of have replicated this sort of study model across a number of different subsistence important species. And that's what that looks like in the field. That's some outplanting with the Seldovia Village tribe, and then that is myself, our director, Jeff Hedrick, and our biologist, Annette Jarris, in Seward. We do a number of clam and habitat surveys, so habitat suitability studies just to determine what clam populations look like in areas, if there are areas that can support clams that don't have them. So we evaluate clam size classes, population densities, and substrate types. And we also combine this with traditional ecological knowledge in the communities. So we ask people where there were clams, and if they aren't there anymore, we're trying to evaluate why. We also use drone imaging and GIS to create clam density predictions and habitat suitability maps. So I'm just going to close with this really cool study that Annette Jarris, our biologist, is working on. She's also a master's student with UAF CFOS, and this is a paralytic shellfish toxin evaluation in shellfish in a Fognac beach in Seward. So what she did was she went out and she kind of collected 3 different species of shellfish at this beach over 2 summers, and evaluated them for total paralytic shellfish toxins, as well as looked at toxin congeners. So this is kind of one of many sort of subsistence important studies that we're doing. People want to know, can they eat shellfish? When can they eat shellfish? Is it safe? And so we use Seward as kind of a model for that. And what we actually found is the levels of paralytic shellfish toxins in Seward are fairly low. So that's good news. And over the course of 2 summers, as you can see, we have 80 micrograms per 100 grams is the legal limit for shellfish consumption. And as you can see, we are way down at the bottom. Another really interesting finding that Annette has found is that the congener profiles change over time. So different toxins appear at different times of the year, which is super interesting, and she's kind of evaluating that a little bit more. We have a bunch of posters this evening that are kind of cover more of these projects in detail, and then some other projects that I didn't bring up tonight, but I tried to cram as much as I could in 15 minutes. So this is my contact information. Our website is there if you want to check out everything that we do. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Maile. And honestly, thank you to all the folks at Alutiiq Pride that are in the room. 30 years of work in this is really fantastic. So thanks for the presentation. Our next presenters, Provan Crump with Pro Aquaculture Solutions and Eric Wyatt with Alaska Oyster Cooperative Sea Otter Sound, are presenting an abstract titled Optimizing Oyster Hatchery, Post-Nursery and Farming Production in Alaska's Unique Conditions. Welcome, Eric and Provan.
Good morning, everyone. This is a kind of an observational presentation based off working up here in Alaska, and also I live in Prince Rupert, which is just across the border in Canada. And it's I've been in shellfish farming for a long time, and it's very unique as soon as you get into these colder conditions on how you have to do things in my eyes. You know, it's very different from other places I've farmed. So, again, it's only 15 minutes, so it's just an overview. It's kind of like looking at, you have these optimal temperature range that a lot of Pacific oyster shellfish farming is conducted in, and then a wide amount of tolerance. So Pacific oysters have a massive tolerance in temperature and in salinity. Farming areas up here generally are done in full salinity water, so that's not really the main pressing factor, it's temperature. It's not really representative because it's, again, a shorter talk, so I can't really go into the total average growing temperature for all different regions. But you can do the lowest and the highest, and just through different growing areas around the world, the bottom level is kind of like more prime areas. You move up, and you can see that the temperatures get significantly cooler, as in a min and a max of temperature. So Alaska, northern British Columbia are more unique in regards to what the temperature is and then how many growing days you have per year. Can we optimize production? So spat production considerations are, normal, like around the world from my observations of traveling to all different hatchery locations and nursery locations is, you can have a land-based nursery or a flupsy that you can just put seed into and run and get good growth rates out of in warmer water conditions where there's a longer growing season. But for Alaska and northern British Columbia, there's this stepping stone. It looks like a post-nursery that to bump the seed up from being able to buy it even 2.38 millimeter screen seed, 4 millimeter screen seed, to bump it up to a larger, bump it up to 4 millimeter seed, and then putting it into a flupsy enables you to get like a faster growth curve. So it's an interesting one, which it's been something that I've struggled with a bit of being like, well, what do you do? And does it make sense to heat water for a post-nursery and grow food? But it seems it does. Going in again to temperature, I've been working in hatcheries in Hawaii, which is vastly different. Our water was coming out at a perfect temperature. Here, heating your water is a major consideration. Like, I've spent months trying to work out how to effectively heat water. From a boiler system, it's getting archaic. To use heat pumps, no one's specifically designing heat pumps that can work to heat all your water. So you kind of have to do it yourself, come up with heat recapture, heating systems that allow you to do it in a cost-effective manner. So it's just, again, temperature is playing a major role in redesign, rethinking how you do things. Broodstock condition considerations. So this is a really interesting one of, I don't even know, like thousands and thousands of broodstock that I've conditioned without even thinking about it to spawn, every week. And I start trying to condition broodstock in Alaska, and they weren't conditioning. They were looking ripe in the middle of winter, and then would just trickle out as soon as you brought them up in temperature. And it comes down to this, the degree days. There's not enough degree days for oysters to get to spawning in Alaska, but it is enough to get them very confused. So they look, frustrated. They look ripe, but they're not ripe. And then to get them to actually get ripe, you have to put them in a conditioning system to make them go, okay, it is summer, and go through a cycle so you can use them the next year. So it adds a whole nother level, which was interesting to find out, but I was like, I have no idea what's happening. You know, these oysters are acting very strange. But anyhow, it's just, again, degree days. So it just shows that that oysters are right on their tolerance. Well, Pacific oysters are right on their tolerance zone. That, you know, anything you can do to make the oyster work better in the cooler conditions, you know, can add, you know, it will take time off the production cycle. Post-hatchery nursery considerations, again, another one that was looking into what can you do. So being able to have a hatch, like a post-nursery, to be able to bump seed up, because everyone's familiar, you want your seed, oyster seed, at a certain time of year. So then any hatchery production has to start way before that. So let's say May, June, you want oysters in the water, and you only have till September, October of a growing season. Being able to have larger seed at that point can potentially shave a huge amount of time off a growing cycle. So yeah, we're working on this through the AFDF Joint Innovation Grant of trying to come up with a design for doing post-nursery work to see if how feasible it is. Yeah, importance of incoming oyster seed size to grow out performance in flupsies. So this is Eric's work. Do you want to talk about it a bit, or are you good? Do you want me to?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I realize that a lot of people probably have trouble understanding what the heck we're talking about. But the bottom line is that when when the oysters are very small, they barely survive here. And that's really where the biggest challenge in producing them is and growing them. And I've experienced, you know, I have a big nursery, a floating upwater system, it's called. So I produce a pretty good chunk of the oyster seed, you know, for Alaskan farmers. And these are some of the observations I found out, and it's just trying to quantify a bit. I figured out, you know, after I delved down into my data, maybe it's a little bit loose. So I'm going to say, I see these big trends, though, and I've been pushing, you know, our hatchery suppliers that we could only get a little smaller seed size for years, and so that's what I put up with, and has major negative economic effect on my business. I mean, like struggle. And that even means struggle so that the next stage is to the farmers, and every downstream part of that is more of a struggle. Now I've been able to source more and more. In this case, we're calling a 3mm seed, a bigger seed. I can see dramatic improvements, you know, in the outcomes. And so just a little bit different. Apparently I'm not prepared to speak very well. Okay, one of the things down here, one of my bullets down here says 60 Fahrenheit. You know, it's about 15 C, is this threshold. And there's been a lot of different people kind of talking about flupsies or, you know, new interest, especially. I'm located in the farthest southern part of the state, right? And this threshold is important for oyster seed, and we've known about it. I mean, Alaska, I know since the 90s is what I've heard, you know. And if you're not able to get above that threshold, and I'm calling it a nursery and a flupsy, your performance is terrible. The seed that you get out, in my opinion, isn't as good, and it continues on not as good. If you can get above that threshold in a meaningful amount, then you have better outcomes. So that's one of the things to consider, you know, the people that are thinking about doing nurseries in the West or, you know, colder water. One of my thoughts about it is actually producing bigger seed, like 1/4 inch or something, and down south and sending it up here. But there's ways to try to get around that instead of just kind of beating our head against the wall. There has been some improvements in the last 20 years, but not a lot. and we can do better. So one other thing is, it was a warmer summer, that El Nino pattern where, weather sucked up here and it was beautiful down in southeast. And so I saw my water temperature in an enclosed bay where I'm trying to get the warmest water to do my nursery operation. And my average for the second part of August was 16.1 Z, well above that 60 threshold. And my performance was almost twice as good as, say, 2 years previous when it was about 14.1 C in the same period. So that little bit of difference makes a tremendous change in the outcome. And there's something to learn there. It's in the seed, but it's everywhere else too. The implications are huge, and we kind of simplify it and we think, well, I know that, but do you really? So I think that's one of the main lessons that we wanted to give on that. Thank you.
Yeah. So again, just to go through it, it's been a learning curve for me. I'm a problem solver. I enjoy solving problems in hatcheries and nurseries, and looking at how to develop industry. And it's an interesting one. The temperature really does rule how you have to do things. So, and what your growth rates can be. So again, it's like any way to optimize and look at better ways of getting larger seed, getting larger animals in, and optimizing the growing season. And again, there's a great paper that was produced out of Alaska in 1998 that has all this information in it, but it's like a reiteration of the importance of taking that into consideration for the industry. Thank you.
Thanks, Phyllis. Our next presenter is Francis Pan with Pacific Hybreed Incorporated, and he's presenting an abstract titled Breeding Shellfish for Climate Change Resilience. Welcome, Francis.
How do I advance? Oh, okay, got it. Thanks. Okay. Hello, everyone. So Pacific Hybreed is a shellfish genetics company with the primary goal of breeding shellfish for improved seed and also farm stocks. And we're based in Washington, Seattle area, and we use a breeding approach called crossbreeding. As you can see sort of on the far right there. So it takes naturalized populations into what we call hybrid seed. So this is within species hybrid, okay, by crossing different inbred lines. So going from a naturalized population into through 3 generations of founder families, higher yielding, and then eventually to hybrid crosses. And then, so that's on the hatchery side of things. And then one really critical component for us is farm testing, right? Because our seed and larvae can do as well as they do in the hatchery, but if that doesn't get translated onto farms, then it kind of doesn't really make sense to keep them. So because of that 3 generations of breeding, it also gives us a lot of opportunities to multiple rounds of field testing. And so last year, we were able to work at several locations, with several of them in Washington State, also in California, and all the way down 1,000 miles south of Washington into Baja, California, with really that scientific question of whether we need to find specific genetic lines for specific locations, or can we find generalists that we can use for multiple farms. And I don't think I have time to go into the details of each figure, but I'll be happy to talk more about it. But you're looking at yield performance for seed for each of the farms across different lines, different genetic lines. And in 2 months, in collaboration with NOAA Fisheries in Alaska, including Gary Fleener, who's coming up to talk next, we will be deploying our family lines in Southeast Alaska. with understanding that environment is very different across the huge range of Alaska. So we'll start there and hopefully expand our family into more farms across different regions. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis. Our next presenter, Henry Fleener with NOAA's Alaska Fisheries Science Center, is presenting an abstract called Advancement of Pacific Oyster Research in Alaska Through Field Testing of Genetic Groups. Please welcome Henry. I'll see what I can do. Yeah, they put the one on deck.
I'll just wing it then. Hi, my name is Henry Fleener. I'm the hatchery manager with NOAA Alaska Fisheries Science Center in Juneau, Alaska. And today I'll be talking about Alaska oyster seed supply and genetics. And really my talk will be kind of combining the last two talks from Francis and Eric and Provan and how hatchery production and seed production intertwines with genetics. So first, I'm going to go over the life cycle of an average farmed oyster in Alaska. So for an oyster, you're an egg and a sperm, fertilization occurs, then you become a larvae. That's about 2 or 3 weeks, and life is really good for you because you're in Hawaii or the Pacific Northwest. And so when we talk about hatcheries, it really just means larval production. And also at these hatcheries, we have Brian Koval here, Hawaiian shellfish. He also settles those larvae and then raises them in a small nursery system and produces small seed for Alaska. And so once those seed are a decent size, something like 2 to 5, probably up to 6 millimeters, then they go to a nursery or FLEPC in Alaska and life changes for you. So you have big seed that's being produced in a FLEPC, and a FLEPC is really just a term, is style of nursery. A nursery just means juvenile growth. And then once you're big enough and timing's right, then you can become an adult on a farm in Alaska. And then life ends for you at the half-shell market. And so as you can see, there's a big chunk that's kind of missing here. And that's because there's no in-state hatchery production or genetic selection programs. So although the hatchery in Hawaii or those in the Pacific Northwest have selected broodstock, they're not selected for optimal conditions in Alaska. Not to say they're bad broodstock, but they're just not optimal. So that's a concern, is number one, seed security in Alaska, as well as advancement of oyster genetics. Sort of a dead end when you're not finishing this cycle. So what are we doing at NOAA AFSC in Juneau? Well, first, we're starting the state's first public research hatchery and nursery for Alaska. What we're planning on doing is taking over a small wet lab and turning it into a research hatchery. We'll have, it'll be a collaborative space for industry and regulatory-driven hatchery research and training. We'll have some pretty innovative hatchery systems. We'll have photobioreactors. There's also systems called ultra-density larval systems that are capable of rearing oyster larvae at really, really high densities compared to standard conditions. And we'll also look at new species exploration. James Crump will talk about that next. And we'll also be working on holding and producing limited genetic groups of Pacific oysters for field testing. And so that's the second part of this, is the genetic research. How do we stop this from being a dead-end cycle? Well, we need to provide information to big breeding groups like Pacific Hybreed and the USDA. The USDA works closely with Hawaiian shellfish. So if we can provide data from field testing to the USDA, then, and we're already starting this in 2024, in 2025, 2026, we should have better oysters for Alaska. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Henry. Our next presenter, James Crump with the University of Alaska Fairbanks, is presenting an abstract entitled Assessing Pinto Abalone Mariculture Potential in Alaska. Welcome, James.
Thanks, Jason. Let's see. Okay. So yeah, my name's James Crump. I'm a graduate student at University of Alaska Fairbanks based in Juneau, and I'm part of a team along with Alaska Fisheries Science Center, NOAA right next door, that are working on assessing pinto abalone mariculture potential in Alaska. So I first wanted to give everybody just a quick run through of the farmed abalone life cycle. We don't have any farmed abalone or any commercial abalone farms in the state of Alaska as of yet, but abalone is farmed throughout the world, and we can kind of extrapolate what it might look like here. If we were to cultivate abalone, we'd be cultivating the pinto abalone, which is the only abalone native to the state of Alaska. So there are two main stages for abalone mariculture. The first is this hatchery nursery stage, which is the first 6 to 12, or sometimes it can last longer, up to 6 to 24 months. During this stage, abalone are raised primarily indoors, and this is a picture from a commercial abalone nursery in Santa Barbara. They're raised in these cylindrical tanks. They consume microalgae, kind of biofilms of microalgae, and during this stage, like oysters, there's pretty fragile. There's a high mortality during this stage, so keeping them inside where you can cultivate microalgae for them and give them just the right diet and the right conditions to grow strong is ideal. They'll be grown generally up to 1 to 3 centimeters during this stage before they transition more to the grow-out stage. So the grow-out stage is basically when abalone switch from eating microalgae to macroalgae. They'll be instead consuming primarily kelps, but also other species of seaweeds too. There's a variety of ways that this grow-out stage occurs in abalone farms throughout the world. In the US, most of the farms are actually land-based, flow-through farms, but in the biggest abalone-producing nations such as South Korea and China, most production has moved over to ocean-based farms, as you can see in the bottom middle there. So this is kind of what we envisioned would probably make the most sense for Alaska, so we're not having to, heat seawater, and we've got all this space. But basically, they have kelp farms sited adjacent to the abalone farms. They can go grab a bunch of kelp, barge it over to the abalone, plop them on top of these floating rafts, and the abalone will eat it all up. So it's a pretty nice, simple system. And so you grow abalone, they eat a lot of kelp during this time, and then abalone will be grown anywhere from about 5 to 10 centimeters generally. Some people sell them at this 5 centimeter size as kind of a petite market, but generally they'll reach this 10 centimeter size and will get pretty good value for them. So just real quick, the work that we are doing in our team, we're kind of divided into 3 parts. The first is we're working to optimize hatchery practices and nursery survival rate for Alaskan pinto abalone. So we did our first abalone spawn in November. We have a research hatchery in Juneau, and we're working on bettering microalgae cultivation techniques and some other things that we hope can increase the speed and the survival rate of abalone growth during this stage. The second objective, and this is really the focus of my master's work, is investigating the optimal seaweed diet that maximizes pinto abalone growth rate. So I've been feeding medium-age abalone diets of either sugar kelp, Pacific dulse, or a combination of the two to see how they grow. And so far we've gotten some good results. Haven't found much of a difference between these diets, which is good news because we'd likely be feeding abalone primarily kelp in Alaska. The abalone that I've raised have grown about 1.5 centimeters over the course of 6 months, and that's been between 9 and 12 degree water temperature, which is a pretty similar rate to other species of abalone that have been cultivated. You can see really cool thing is that abalone will grow different colorations of shell depending on the diet of seaweed that's fed to them. So you can see that green one was fed sugar kelp, that red one was fed Pacific dulse, and the bottom one was fed a combination of the two. Not great color up there, but you can imagine. And finally, we actually just got approved for some Build Back Better funding to explore basically farm gear, ocean-based farm gear that would work in Alaska. You saw those Korea cages are pretty large scale, so we're looking for farm gear that would work at a smaller scale, and also things that would allow us to move abalone out into the wild as early as possible, basically because minimizing this nursery time and getting stuff out to farmers, and where that's what we do best in Alaska. So yeah, happy to chat abalone anytime this week. Come find me. Thanks.
Thank you, James. Our next and final presenter for this session, Tamsin Peoples with UAF's College of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences, is presenting an abstract titled Kelp, I Need Some Algae Kelp Hatchery Innovation.
Good morning. My name is Tamsin. As you mentioned, I'm at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and I've been working in the commercial seaweed mariculture in Alaska since 2015, mainly in the hatchery stage. I've designed, built, and operated now 3 commercial kelp hatcheries throughout the state. And I was fortunate enough to get into the master's program, and I realized that there is still a lot of work to be done on the hatchery stage. Listening to and talking with farmers, there's a lot of concern and a lot of room for improvement. I was lucky enough to get Mariel Dietrich to help me out with an amazing project that we actually won the Algae Prize with. And it really focuses on the seed string method, which is kind of the industry standard right now within the state, where in the hatchery we raise kelp on these pieces of string wrapped around pipes that then go out to the farms and outplant and grow into the big plants. That seed string is incredibly expensive. It can be one of the most, if not the largest annual expense for a commercial farm every single year. That string itself is single use, so at the end of every season after harvest, they have to strip that line off the ropes and throw it into the dump. And it's really durable, which can be a nuisance during harvest. It can create these large entanglements and can actually strip the kelp off the lines during harvest. So in hopes of reducing expense, labor, and plastic waste, we sought to find a natural fiber that would degrade after that kelp develops onto the rope. And then to help reduce expense in the hatchery stage, we also wanted to look at finding a novel fertilizer to help drive down that expense. Several different types of fertilizers were tried. The Provan enriched seawater with iodine is kind of the gold standard for kelp cultivation, but it's incredibly expensive and very laborious to make in the nurseries or hatcheries. We looked at this novel fertilizer, Jack's Special 2515, which is a water-soluble commercial plant fertilizer. You can buy it off Amazon. So we looked at that at different concentrations and with and without the addition of iron, which is required for gametophyte fertility. And then we also tried it against F/2, which is one of the common fertilizers used in commercial hatcheries now. But this F/2 is designed for microalgal cultivation, which can be a nuisance because microalgae can serve as a contaminant in the hatcheries. We also looked at a number of different fibers. These were all things we could find at local craft stores or at local hardware stores. We wanted to make sure it was cheap and readily available for hatcheries across the state. This also became a huge issue during COVID when we couldn't actually find some of the fibers that we were hoping to trial against. We chose to work with sugar kelp because it's one of the most widely cultivated species across Alaska. It also has very delicate branching holdfasts. So the thought was if the sugar kelp can survive and grow off of these natural fibers, hopefully it would work just as well, if not better, for other kelp species with more robust holdfasts. I did actually 3 years of outplanting, but I really only have data from 2. That first year was delayed so long because of COVID that I didn't really get any good data. These were from outplanting, so we really wanted to ensure that our results were applicable in the field and would actually work on a commercial kelp farm, not just in the lab and in tanks. These are the fertilizer results. It is key to note that the scaling bars are different between the years. 2022 was a great year for kelp. It was warm and it was salty. 2023 was a little colder and with a heavier freshwater lens, which was more detrimental to the kelp. 2022, the obvious winner was that half-strength Provan enriched seawater with iodine. But in 2023, all 3 Jack's trials outperformed the Provan enriched seawater with iodine. And what was really interesting in 2023 is that it greatly outperformed the F/2, which is the current industry hatchery standard. For fibers, my first year outplanting, all my natural fibers disintegrated before the kelp could grow, so I really only have 1 good year of data. It was not deterred. I was determined to find one. So we had a number that we tried out this last year. We had a number of successes between cotton cords, a hemp cord, and a beading silk. The numbers above the bars represent the break strength of the fibers if they were present. Of those final ones, silk was the only one that totally dissolved at the time of harvest. So the kelp had totally grown off the natural fiber onto the rope, and there was nothing left. This could be incredibly beneficial to farmers during harvest because you don't have the risk of, again, that stripping, that entanglement, or even of that fiber going into your final product. And then for a quick cost analysis, this is broken down cost per meter for the different fertilizers. You can see how expensive that Provostolius enriched seawater with iodine is. The cost per tank refers to a 50-liter tank over the entire 2-month hatchery process there. And then for the fibers, even though the silk sounds very fancy and very rich, it was not that expensive. It was cheaper than the hemp and some of even the cotton materials that I were using from the craft store. What's really exciting is we're now doing this at commercial scale, working with sequester farms in Juneau for both bull kelp and sugar kelp. So it'll be really exciting to see how this applies at commercial scale on a working farm. Happy to chat more. We do have a poster about that bull kelp project during our poster session tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Tamsin, and thanks again to all of our panelists for the wonderful presentations this morning. It's now time for audience Q&A. You can see there's a QR code up on the screen that will give you access to the Slido app. You can both submit your questions. If you hop on the app, you can also thumbs up a question, which will get it up on the list a little bit. And we'll also have folks going around the room with a microphone if you raise your hand. And I'll kick things off, I suppose, with a question. What are the challenges for producers to work together in cooperation to overcome post-harvesting hurdles? And you guys can access your mic by just pressing the button at the bottom. You guys can answer questions from the table there. Once you hit it, the red light will go on. Want me to repeat the question? Yeah. What are the challenges for producers to work together in cooperation to overcome post-harvesting hurdles? Sorry. Yeah, I was fed a question. Sorry, my bad. Do we have... I guess I don't have a prompted question right now. This is very embarrassing. Do we have anything from the audience here?
Hi, thanks for all those presentations. That was really interesting. I had a question for Maile about whether the HPLC study continued past 2022. We found in Southeast really low bloom levels in 21 and 22, but much higher in 23. And curious about those congenital profiles. Thanks.
It did not. We ran out of funding.
All right, we've got some questions coming in via Slido. Thanks, folks, for hopping on the app. What is the range of abalone in Alaska? Great. This one looks like it's for Tamsin. How do different natural fibers compare in cost per foot?
Yes, there was a brief table that was thrown up there, and I can go into more detail about that. The hold-fast line was kind of the industry standard. Now that takes about 6 cents per meter, and then the silk was the 12 cents a meter. Some of the other ones were 9. The cotton was, I think, 6 cents a meter as well. So it kind of does all the range. These, again, were just the fibers that we could find around Juneau that we wanted to give a shot at trying. I think there's still a lot more room for further testing of these ones. And I found out that not all of the quote-unquote same poundage test for all those fibers are created equal. So one season worked well, and the next season I tried a different material that said it had the same rating, and it totally dissolved. So it's going to be pretty specific on the exact type that you buy.
Thanks, Tamsin. This one's for James. Do you have an idea of what the price point of kelp would sell for as an input for abalone feed, for abalone to sell at a market price?
I don't have a specific idea of that. It's going to have to be pretty dang low. So I mean, yeah, consistent supply of seaweed is definitely of cheap seaweed is definitely going to be a hurdle for abalone aquaculture, and something that'll make it a lot easier if the kelp industry keeps developing in Alaska and gets bigger. And I would say I've been kind of doing some rough calculations, and from interviews with farmers, it seems like you need about, this is real rough, so, but 7 pounds of sugar kelp maybe, or seven pounds of giant kelp, I think, is what it takes for them to produce a market-sized abalone down in California. So if you say have 100,000 abalone on your farm, that means to raise all of those abalone to market size, you'll need about 700,000 pounds of kelp. So it gives you a scale maybe of what amount of kelp we're talking about.
Thanks, James. I see we have a question in the room here. Mariculture.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for great presentations. Those were really intriguing. I have a couple of questions one for Tamsin. Is we've used a number 15 seine twine as our seed string because it's available locally in the marine store, and I'm really intrigued by the natural fiber component. The seine twine is pretty inexpensive and available. But I'd love to talk to you further about the efficacy of it and whether or not it's something that we could, that you find that the side-by-side inoculation that the spore would take to them at the same level as it did other fibers, or if you saw any differentiation in density at the end of the day. And then for James, we had an opportunity to provide some kelp to a abalone operation down in California, and interestingly they've got sugar kelp and alaria, and the report back is the abalone didn't care for the alaria, but the sugar kelp they jumped right on. So I thought that was just an interesting anecdotal information, and I think the abalone is a really intriguing opportunity. But I think it may work best just like the Korean model, where you're growing the kelp, and instead of buying feed, you're growing the kelp as feed for the abalone that is really your market product. Thank you.
Something of interest. In the early 2000s, a fellow named Greg Clark was experimenting and farming abalone at Cape Pole on Kosciuszko Island. And what's interesting is he was also in partnership with a little company out of Port Protection, and they were harvesting bull kelp and turning it into this plant food. You could even buy it at the local hardware store, a liquid fertilizer. Old stories, huh? But they were also drying the product, so he was feeding dried bull kelp to the abalone. Seemed to be doing good. And I can point out, it could be B grade or something, kelp too, and it can be frozen. So there's an opportunity to value added here. Take the best stuff, find some other market, and it definitely, he was seeing some degree of success, and then died in a boating accident, and that was the end of that exploration. But anyway, pretty impressive. There's something there.
Yeah.
Another one for, go.
I was going to say, to answer Marcus, yeah, I haven't experimented with anything the same lines. The holdfast was kind of the East Coast manual standard. I was kind of basing everything off of what open source manuals are available for hatchery operators to work out of. There's some new great work being done with some folks with Sea Grant to do an Alaskan-based manual. So I think there's a lot of room for looking at more things that we have access to as well, like seine twine. It could be definitely one of interest because it is so prevalent in these coastal communities with fishing.
And yeah, real quick to your point, Marcos, what we found with comparing sugar kelp to dulse was that the abalone, the growth rates were similar, but you couldn't feed them both at the same time, because then, well, you could, but the abalone would always eat that sugar kelp first. But if you just forced them to eat the dulse, they would grow great off of it. So I wonder with that farm in California if they added the alaria along with a bunch of other seaweeds and they just wouldn't touch it, or if they if you could force feed them basically. we kind of think of it as like the the dulse is their veggies and the sugar kelp's kind of their potato chips or something.
We can grow sugar kelp in large volumes, so
yeah, it's not something we have to worry about.
Why fix it if it ain't broke? And I'd love to get away from into a biodegradable string entirely. I mean, I think that would be a real advancement for all of us.
Just scanning the room for another question. I'll go to the Slido app. When increasing kelp production, how is water area allocated for you, and how does it interfere with boating traffic? So, let me go to another question.
Yeah,
here.
we grew our kelp on for our lines in June. We're pretty short little long lines right off of Cobbin Island near Auk Bay, which is nice and close for us. It's actually part of a state park there. The only boat, and that's actually one of the most high traffic areas for boating in all of the Juneau area. All of the whale watching boats go in and out right next to where we had our long lines in the water. We never had any vessel interactions, other than I think we had some lines stripped because people thought they were crab pots that they could pull up and steal from. So that was the only interaction we ever had with any vessels.
Thanks, Tamsin. Is direct seeding currently being researched in the hopes of replacing seed line altogether?
Oh yeah, there's a lot of research going on, not only in this country, but all across the world. A lot of the foremost success that there has been reported has all been very proprietary. So it's not really open to the layman or someone who wants to try and do it without being tied directly to an operator who says and claims that they have this great results, but their methods have not been published or verified under peer-reviewed journals. So the technology is getting there. I think that's definitely going to be the end-all be-all. I see that as being the final future for kelp. Ideally, these results will be obsolete within a decade. We'll move away from seed string entirely, with this kind of a stopgap measure to help improve that process for farmers in the interim until that technology is finalized and developed.
Tamsin, we have another question for you. Any idea on the limitations of availability for different natural fibers at scale in Alaska?
Yeah, that's kind of one of the big issues too that we encountered during one of our experimentation. I actually had to send my dad to a Joann's in Seattle when he was down there to pick up some extra fiber. It's been hard to find a lot of these natural fibers at scale, again, for the ones that have their same replication. I had success with hemp, for example, last year in 2023, tried to find one of the exact same size but in a larger volume of the same poundage, and it failed. In theory, it was exactly the same, but it failed this year compared to last year. So again, there is that variability, and so finding an exact, I didn't realize how specific I needed to be on finding a very, very precise, replicable, scalable fiber as and potentially another challenge, and whether that means going directly to those manufacturers, which could also help drive down the cost of that string as well.
Thanks, Samson. What else we got here? How sensitive are oyster spat in a flupsy to environmental contaminants like you might run into in a small boat harbor?
Mostly not. If you look at examples in Washington or on the East Coast, you know, they most don't seem to have a problem. And then, you know, they got to go from there out to a farm that's got certified water, and you know they got years to grow. So if there was anything in there, it doesn't affect them. They're eating phytoplankton and zooplankton, and so if those aren't contaminated, they're probably not picking it up. But over.
Great. I have another question for you, Eric. What is the average growth rate for oysters in your flupsy?
That's a difficult question. Average. Well, I was trying to explain, it varies wildly. And if you can think, and I was saying 2021 where it was like 2 degrees less than my average in 2023. You know, it won't be like that next year. You guys will have nice weather and it'll be La Nina, it'll suck down there again. But still, so what I say, depends on what kind of seed. Somewhere between 30 to 70% will make it to a 5/8 big farm size in 5 months. You know, and if it's cooler, then a lot less do. I mean, it's dramatic. So it's, and when you talk about one of the metrics of wisdom in farming is how many animals you've killed. You start talking about nursery systems, right, or hatcheries. It is many millions. And anyway, it's not for the faint of heart.
Thanks, Eric. This is a question for Henry. Is there any regulatory concerns with warming water temps in Alaska that oysters might start spawning here? How would that impact your work?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think as far as regulations, I'm just a researcher and have nothing to do with that. As far as if there's, maybe your question is about genetic selection. If we're improving oysters for Alaska, and I think the big thing there is if you know about oyster physiology, you know the risk is really low, but we don't have a great idea of what that risk is. So we're actually starting with Jordan Hollersmith to look into that question and NOAA AFSC group. And I can say at least that we know that oysters are pretty darn confused up here, but we have heard some anecdotal evidence of oysters spawning. So it's certainly something that the state should look into.
Thanks, Henry. Back to the room, another question from Mark Shear.
Yeah, thank you. This is a question for Tamsin or anyone that has some information. I'm just curious if you've trialed seeding with gametophytes versus seeding spore-based seeding, and whether you've seen some promise in that.
I haven't personally, but I know there are some folks in the room that definitely have, and that there's a lot of folks on the East Coast too that have looked into that. Again, most of this project I was following the open source manuals that we had available, which there are not very many of, so that was something that we can definitely look forward to. I think there's a lot of really cool work going on currently.
Tamsin, another question, I suppose this one's geared towards you. Is there an impact of natural fibers on sensory properties of the kelp?
Ooh, interesting. When we did an initial trial of a bunch of different fibers, we actually tried a couple extra ones that we had, like a bamboo fiber, and then a couple other different cottons, including a sisal, and which made from agave, and I've tried like a jute cord. They stick to everything. They really like pretty much every single surface they will stick to. The biggest issue I found is that as those fibers degrade and shed, that rate of shedding can basically slough off those little gametophytes as they're growing. So, I mean, I've had them stick to all sorts of things, Tyvek, coffee mugs, glass slides. Like, they'll stick to pretty much everything that they like. They like white, shiny things a lot, too, I've found. So I kind of lean towards the more lighter colored fibers, or quote-unquote natural fibers. But they seem to basically stick to every single surface when they're healthy and happy.
Thanks, Tamsin. For James, when looking at diet preferences of abalone for kelp, are you looking at just different preferences for portions of kelp? For instance, stipe versus blade?
We haven't looked at that. That's a good question. Mostly we've been feeding them kelp that we've been growing in our lab, so we've just been lopping it up above the merostem and leaving the stipes, so we haven't really fed them much for stipes. I know urchins eat a ton of stipes. I don't think abalone consume as much, like, are known to consume as much kelp stipes in the wild, but you know, they get hungry, they'll eat. Seems like they'll eat a lot of things. There's people right now in New Zealand. I just saw a study that they're working at using leftover like grape mark from like vineyards to feed abalone, so you can feed them a lot of stuff. So I bet stipes, you know, wouldn't be an exception.
Thanks. For oyster and abalone ocean-based farms, are there predators that have to be considered and dealt with?
Yes.
Eric, this is another one to you, I suppose. What's the typical mortality rate for oysters?
Well, here's a rule of thumb, I think, that's bore out over time. That if farmer took the amount of seed that they purchased, kind of invoice, and then they looked at what they finally sold in the end, you should start with a 50% mortality number to put you in the air region. It could be higher, but we work from that to make it better.
Great, thanks, Eric. James, is abalone cultivation economically viable? The question just went away. Could you guys scan back down? There we go. Yeah, is abalone cultivation economically viable in Alaska? It could be symbolic with and help the success of cultivated kelps as the main feed for abalone farms?
I don't know, honestly, is the answer to that question. I think that's what we're trying to figure out, and we've done, some good stuff in the lab. The next step, as I said, is trying to work to get some seed growing out in the ocean. So yeah, there's one farm right now, oyster farm based in northern Prince of Wales, Knockley Bay Oyster Farms, that actually got a special permit from Fish and Game to get a small amount of like juvenile abalone and then grow them out on their farm. And we're also, we as well as actually Alutiiq, are hoping to get them some different batches of abalone seed to just try it out, basically. Kind of think that the proof's going to be in the pudding. I would say that I think that the viability of abalone farming in Alaska is going to kind of coincide with how good we get at growing kelp. Because I think, if you, a lot of the abalone farms in California, they do grow some on-land dulse, but they're pretty reliant on actually harvesting like really large amounts of giant kelp in a pretty sustainable fashion, because there's just a lot of giant kelp down there. I don't think we have the same amount of wild kelp, perennial wild kelp, that we could harvest to rely on here. So we need to get the kelp farming industry to a point where it's, there's enough of it to feed to your abalone. But I definitely do think that the two of them go hand in hand. They've worked really, really well together in Korea. And I think the folks that visited there last spring, I think some stat that somebody came back with was that something like 70% of the kelp that's grown there is for abalone cultivation, which, is a lot of kelp. But they've gotten, I think it's helped them grow kelp for food and vice versa. They're working on strain selection so that they can grow kelp through the summer months, because you also have to figure out how you're going to feed them after the kelp goes away on the farms. So I think that the two are pretty tightly linked, I would say.
Thanks, James. We have time for one more question. We're going to take it to the room.
This question's for Provan. It seems like water temperature is one of the main factors of challenges need to overcome in Alaska. I was just wondering if there's been any advancements or new technology in order to heat water a little more effectively, the cost of electricity and cost of diesel and these sort of things. What would be your recommendations for people that are trying to heat water to make oysters grow faster in Alaska? Thank you.
Yeah, heat pumps. Technology's advanced pretty heavily for heat pumps that can work in colder climates, but still, is there one that's custom built for aquaculture and how we use heat pumps? Not really. So it's developing. So I'm working with some companies to try and work on that, to have a heat pump system, designed for aquaculture use. So yeah, but it's incredible. Like, I still can't believe that you can get like 70% savings from a conventional like gas boiler system that we've all used in aquaculture. Then, with a heat pump, you can have 70% up to 80% savings in energy. So it's pretty incredible.
Thanks, and thanks again to. We have one more question from the room. Dan Lash.
Thanks for slipping me in. I wanted to especially thank Provan and Francis for coming from down south, and I wanted to ask you, we need a lot of innovation, clearly, as we hear all this in our industry, in the hatchery nursery sector. How do we marry the expertise outside the state with that inside? What recommendations or what observations have you had as a person not from Alaska engaging in the industry, and what can you teach us?
Well, yeah, I can jump in. Yeah, it's I'm actually just across the border in British Columbia, so very similar farming. I was running a scallop hatchery there, and yeah, I think it's I work with Oceans Alaska, and we do workshops to promote understanding and growth. But I think it goes into collaboration with successful operations in other places for information transfer, and then fine tuning it for your own conditions. So yeah, I'm I'm working in the same environment, so it's pretty easy for me to work up here in Alaska and talk to people about optimizing, aquaculture.
Yeah, I think pretty much same for us, because our mission is really to serve the West Coast industry, including Alaska and Hawaii. So, so our mission is to test our lines at as many locations as possible, and then cover a huge range of temperatures, and then hoping to improve from, Eric just said 50% mortality, sometimes even much higher, 90 we have heard, bring that way down. It is actually a pleasure for us to come up here to work with farmers and NOAA Fisheries to develop specific lines for Alaska oceans.
Great. Thanks all for the wonderful questions, and thanks to our great panelists.